When a desperate widow and her 7-year-old daughter are forced to accept shelter from a mysterious banker after losing everything, they discover that sometimes the greatest risk isn't starting over, it's learning to love again. But when a letter from the past threatens to tear apart the fragile family they've built, will a child's innocent plea about second chances be enough to save them all? The scorching Kansas sun beat down on Margaret Calloway's face as she stood in her empty barn, staring at the place where their last cow used to sleep. Dust swirled around her worn boots, and the silence felt heavier than the summer heat pressing against the wooden walls. It was August 1867, and everything she had ever loved was disappearing like smoke in the wind. "Mama, I'm hungry," came a small voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see Lucy, her 7-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway with her blonde hair tangled and her dress too big for her thin frame. The child's blue eyes looked tired, older than they should be. Margaret's heart broke a little more each time she saw that look. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said, walking over and smoothing Lucy's hair. "We'll find something for supper." But finding something meant there had to be something to find. Their pantry held only a handful of flour and some dried beans. The vegetable garden had died weeks ago when the well started running dry. Even the chickens were gone now, sold to buy medicine when Lucy had gotten sick last month. Margaret led Lucy back to their small wooden house, trying to think of what story she could tell to make their empty dinner table seem less frightening. The house felt different now without James's heavy footsteps on the porch or his voice calling from the fields. 3 months had passed since her husband rode away with their cattle, promising to return with enough money to save their farm. 3 months of waiting and worrying and watching their world crumble piece by piece. Inside the house, Margaret opened their last jar of preserves and spread the thin layer of jam on 2 pieces of bread. Lucy ate her share quickly, then looked up hopefully for more. Margaret gave the child half of her own portion, pretending she wasn't hungry. "Tell me about Papa again," Lucy said, curling up next to her mother on their old sofa. Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter and began the story Lucy loved to hear. About how James had been the strongest man in 3 counties, how he could lift a full-grown bull and make it look easy. About how he had promised to build them the finest house in Kansas once the cattle sold. But as Margaret spoke, doubt crept into her voice. Where was James now? Why hadn't he sent word? Had something terrible happened to him on the long road to Dodge City? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on their roof. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening. Margaret shivered despite the heat, feeling as if the sky itself was warning her that worse times lay ahead. That night, after Lucy fell asleep, Margaret sat by the window and counted their remaining coins by candlelight. $12.37. Not enough to buy food for more than a few days, certainly not enough to pay the money they owed the bank. She had always been the one to handle the family's money, to make sure they had enough to get by. James was good with animals and crops, but numbers confused him. Now she wished she had been the one to take the cattle to market. At least then she would know what had happened to their last hope. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow she would have to make a decision about their future. She could try to find work in town, but who would hire a woman with a young child and no references? She could write to her sister in Missouri, but the letter would take weeks to arrive, and they didn't have weeks. The candle flickered and went out, leaving Margaret in darkness. She felt more alone than she ever had in her life, responsible for keeping Lucy safe in a world that seemed determined to swallow them whole. In the morning, she would have to be strong again. She would have to find a way to keep hope alive in her daughter's eyes, even when her own hope was nearly gone. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their failing home, Margaret allowed herself to cry for the life they were losing and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The wind continued to howl outside, carrying with it the scent of rain that might never come and the promise of changes that might destroy everything they had left. Margaret fell asleep in her chair, dreaming of better days and waking to find that morning had brought a visitor whose arrival would change everything. Margaret woke to the sound of horse hooves crunching on the dry dirt outside her house. For a moment, her heart jumped with wild hope. Perhaps James had finally returned. She rushed to the window, pushing aside the faded curtains, but the man dismounting from the black horse was a stranger. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a clean white shirt and a vest that looked expensive. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and he moved with the careful confidence of someone used to being important. Most telling of all, he carried himself like a man who had never missed a meal or worried about where his next dollar would come from. "Lucy, stay inside," Margaret whispered, smoothing her hair and straightening her worn dress. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but visitors usually meant trouble for people in their situation. She opened the door before he could knock, trying to look more confident than she felt. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The man removed his hat, revealing kind brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her thin face, the peeling paint on the house, the empty barn behind her. "Mrs. Calloway? I'm Benjamin Hayes. I own the Millfield Bank." Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a well. She had been dreading this visit, knowing it would come eventually. The bank had been patient with their missed payments, but patience only lasted so long. "Mr. Hayes," she managed, gripping the doorframe to keep her hands from shaking. "I've been expecting you. May I come in? I'd like to discuss your situation." Margaret stepped aside, knowing she had no choice. As Hayes entered their small front room, she saw him notice the empty spaces where their good furniture used to be, the water stains on the ceiling, the general air of a home slowly falling apart. "Mama!" Lucy appeared in the doorway, her hair still messy from sleep. She looked at the stranger with curious eyes, unafraid in the way that only children could be. "This is my daughter, Lucy," Margaret said, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "Lucy, this is Mr. Hayes from the bank." Hayes smiled at the little girl, and his whole face seemed to soften. "Hello, Lucy. You look just like your mother." Lucy beamed at the compliment, and Margaret felt a stab of worry. Her daughter was too quick to trust, too eager for kindness from adults. It was a dangerous trait in a world that wasn't always kind to children. "Mrs. Calloway," Hayes said, settling into their worn armchair, "I'll speak plainly. Your husband's debts to the bank total $437. I know that's a substantial sum." Margaret's knees felt weak. She had known they owed money, but hearing the exact amount made it feel real in a way that terrified her. $400 might as well have been $4,000. It was money they would never have. "I understand that Mr. Calloway went to sell cattle to pay this debt," Hayes continued, "but I'm afraid I have some difficult news. The cattle were sold 3 weeks ago in Dodge City for considerably less than expected. The money covered only a small portion of what's owed." "3 weeks ago?" Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "But James should have been back by now. Where is he?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know, Mrs. Calloway. I only know about the cattle sale because the buyer is known to me. As for your husband's whereabouts..." He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like a threat. Lucy moved closer to her mother, sensing the tension in the room even if she didn't understand its source. Margaret pulled her daughter against her side, trying to think of what to say, what to do, how to fix this impossible situation. "However," Hayes said, his voice becoming gentler, "I didn't come here just to deliver bad news. I may have a solution that could benefit both of us." Margaret looked up sharply. In her experience, when men of business talked about solutions that benefited everyone, they usually benefited the man with money more than the one without it. "What kind of solution?" Hayes stood and walked to the window, looking out at their failing farm with eyes that seemed to see everything. "I recently lost my housekeeper. My wife passed away 2 years ago, and I find myself in need of someone to manage my household. The position would provide comfortable living quarters, good wages, and your daughter would receive a proper education in town." Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a way to keep your family together," Hayes said, turning back to face her. "I've seen what happens to families who can't pay their debts, Mrs. Calloway. Children end up in orphanages or worse. Mothers are forced into situations no woman should have to face. This arrangement would spare you both such a fate." The words hit Margaret like cold water. She had tried not to think about what would happen if they lost the farm, but now the possibilities crashed over her like a wave. Lucy taken away, herself working in some terrible place just to survive. Their family destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. "I would need an answer soon," Hayes said, his voice apologetic but firm. "The bank's patience has limits, and there are other creditors involved now. If you're interested in my offer, I would need to know by tomorrow evening." Tomorrow evening. Less than 2 days to decide whether to abandon everything she had built with James, to accept charity from a stranger, to start over in a world she didn't understand. "Can I think about it?" Margaret asked. "Of course," Hayes said, putting his hat back on. "Take all the time you need. But remember, Mrs. Calloway, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered." After he left, Margaret stood at the window watching his horse disappear down the dusty road. Behind her, Lucy was unusually quiet, processing the adult conversation she had witnessed. "Mama," Lucy said finally, "are we going to lose our house?" Margaret turned to look at her daughter. Really look at her. Lucy's dress was patched and faded. Her shoes were worn thin, and she was too skinny for a growing child. But her eyes still held trust, still believed that her mother could fix anything. "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret said honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." As the day wore on, Margaret found herself thinking about Benjamin Hayes and his unexpected offer. There had been something in his manner, a careful kindness that suggested he understood what it meant to lose everything. But accepting his help would mean admitting that James wasn't coming back, that the life she had built here was truly over. The question that would haunt her until tomorrow evening was simple but impossible. Was she brave enough to let go of the past in order to save her daughter's future? Thunder crashed overhead like giant fists pounding on the roof, and Margaret jolted awake in her chair where she'd fallen asleep thinking about Mr. Hayes's offer. Rain poured down the windows in thick streams, and lightning lit up the darkness every few seconds. But something else had woken her. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Someone was pounding on their front door. Margaret's heart hammered as she stood up, her body stiff from sleeping in the chair. Who would be out in weather like this? And why were they knocking so desperately, like their life depended on getting inside? "Mama!" Lucy's frightened voice came from the bedroom doorway. The little girl clutched her rag doll, her eyes wide with fear as another boom of thunder shook the house. "Stay there, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, moving toward the door. The pounding came again, more urgent this time, followed by a man's voice shouting something she couldn't understand over the storm. She pressed her ear to the wooden door. "Who's there?" "Sheriff Morrison from Millfield." "Please, ma'am, I need to speak with you." Margaret's hands shook as she unlatched the door. A man in a soaking wet uniform stood on her porch, water dripping from his hat and coat. Behind him, 2 other men waited on horseback in the pouring rain, their faces grim and serious. "Mrs. Calloway? I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but this couldn't wait until morning." The sheriff's voice was gentle, but his eyes held the kind of sadness that came before terrible news. "What's happened?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. Deep in her heart, she had been preparing for this moment for weeks. "Ma'am, I'm afraid it's about your husband. We found him 2 days ago, about 50 miles south of Dodge City." The sheriff paused, clearly struggling with his words. "I'm very sorry, but he's gone." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but strangely, what she felt wasn't shock. It was a terrible, hollow confirmation of what she'd feared was true. James was never coming home. He would never walk through that door again, never hold Lucy on his lap, never fix the leaking roof or plant new crops in the spring. "How?" she whispered. "Bandits, we think." His horse and belongings were missing, and there were signs of a struggle. "We believe they ambushed him while he was camped for the night." Sheriff Morrison's voice grew even gentler. "He wouldn't have suffered, ma'am. It would have been quick." Margaret felt Lucy's small hand slip into hers. The child had crept up beside her while she wasn't paying attention, and now stood listening to news that would change her world forever. "Is Papa really gone?" Lucy asked in a tiny voice. Margaret knelt down and pulled her daughter close, finally letting the tears come. Yes, sweetheart. Papa's gone to heaven. Lucy began to cry then, the heartbroken sobs of a child who didn't fully understand death, but knew it meant she would never see her father again. Margaret held her tightly, her own tears mixing with her daughter's as the storm raged around them. The burial took place yesterday in Dodge City. Sheriff Morrison continued quietly. We thought it best, given the heat and the distance. I have his personal effects here, his watch and wedding ring. He handed Margaret a small cloth bundle, and she clutched it against her chest. Inside was the gold watch James's father had given him, and the simple band she had placed on his finger 7 years ago. Such small things to represent a whole life, a whole marriage, a whole set of dreams that would never come true. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Calloway, the sheriff said. If there's anything we can do. Margaret looked up at him through her tears. What happens to us now? I mean, legally. What happens to the farm? The sheriff's expression grew even more sympathetic. That's not really my area, ma'am. You'd need to speak with the bank about the property and any debts. But I know Mr. Hayes has been trying to work with families in difficult situations. After the sheriff and his men rode away into the storm, Margaret sat on the floor with Lucy in her arms, both of them crying until they had no tears left. The house felt different now. Not just empty, but haunted by the ghost of the man who would never return to fill it with life again. What are we going to do, Mama? Lucy asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Margaret smoothed her daughter's tangled hair, trying to think clearly through her grief. James was gone, their debts remained, and tomorrow Mr. Hayes would return for his answer. The choice that had seemed so difficult this morning now seemed inevitable. We're going to be brave, she told Lucy. We're going to take care of each other, and we're going to find a way to build a new life. Without Papa? Without Papa, Margaret confirmed, her voice stronger than she felt. But we'll remember him, and we'll carry the good parts of him with us wherever we go. Outside, the storm began to calm, and the first hints of dawn crept through the clouds. Margaret realized she had been awake all night, but she felt more alert than she had in months. Grief was terrible, but at least it was honest. At least now she knew where James was and could stop hoping for something that would never happen. She helped Lucy get dressed and made them both some weak coffee with their last bit of sugar. As they sat at the kitchen table sharing a piece of bread, Margaret made her decision. Lucy, do you remember Mr. Hayes? The man who came yesterday. Lucy nodded, wiping her nose with her sleeve. He offered us a place to live and work for him. It would mean leaving this house and going to live in town. What do you think about that? Lucy was quiet for a long moment, looking around the kitchen where she had eaten breakfast every morning of her life. Would we have enough food there? The question broke Margaret's heart. Her 7-year-old daughter shouldn't have to worry about having enough to eat, but that had become their reality. Yes, Margaret said firmly. Mr. Hayes promised we would have enough food and a warm place to sleep. Then I think we should go, Lucy said with the practical wisdom of a child who had learned too young that life was hard. Papa would want us to be safe and fed. Margaret smiled through her renewed tears. Yes, sweetheart, I think he would. As the sun rose fully over the Kansas prairie, painting the wet earth in shades of gold and amber, Margaret began to pack their few remaining belongings. She was no longer James Calloway's wife. She was a widow with a daughter to protect and a future to build from the ashes of her old life. When Benjamin Hayes arrived that afternoon, he would find a woman transformed by grief into someone ready to face whatever came next. The question was no longer whether she would accept his offer, but whether she was strong enough to embrace the new beginning it represented. Mr. Hayes is coming up the road, Lucy announced from her perch at the front window, where she'd been watching for visitors all morning. Her small face was pressed against the glass, and her breath made little clouds that she wiped away with her sleeve. Margaret set down the wooden box she'd been packing and smoothed her black dress, the only good dress she owned, the one she'd worn to church on Sundays when they still had reason to go. She had braided her hair severely back from her face, trying to look like the kind of woman who could manage a household and raise a child without falling apart. Remember what we talked about, she told Lucy. You must be polite and show Mr. Hayes that you're a good girl who won't cause trouble. Lucy nodded seriously. At 7 years old, she understood that their future depended on making a good impression. The responsibility seemed too heavy for such small shoulders, but grief had aged them both overnight. Through the window, Margaret watched Benjamin Hayes dismount from his horse. Today he wore a dark suit that made him look more formal, more like the banker he was and less like the surprisingly kind man who had offered them shelter. She wondered if he would be different now that he knew about James's death, if pity would change the way he looked at them. The knock came exactly at noon, punctual and businesslike. Margaret opened the door to find Hayes standing with his hat in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Calloway, I heard about your husband. Please accept my condolences. Thank you, Margaret replied, stepping aside to let him enter. I appreciate your sympathy. Hayes looked around the front room, taking in the packed boxes and the general air of departure. His gaze lingered on Lucy, who stood quietly beside her mother, her rag doll clutched in her arms. I see you've made your decision, he observed. Yes, Margaret said, lifting her chin. If your offer still stands, we would be grateful to accept it. Of course it stands. Hayes sat down in the same chair he'd occupied yesterday, but his manner was different now, more careful, as if he was handling something fragile. But I want to make sure you understand exactly what this arrangement entails. Margaret sat across from him, pulling Lucy onto her lap. I'm listening. You would be my housekeeper, Hayes began, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. Your duties would include cleaning, cooking, laundry, and general household management. In return, you and Lucy would have your own quarters in my home, all meals provided, and a salary of $15 per month. $15 a month was more money than Margaret had seen in one place for a long time. It wasn't wealth, but it was security, the promise that Lucy would never go to bed hungry again. Lucy would attend the local school with the other children, Hayes continued. There would be no charge for her education, and she would be treated as any other student, not as a servant's daughter. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. Education was something she had always wanted for Lucy but had never been able to provide. In their rural area, school was a luxury most farm children couldn't afford. What about Sundays? Margaret asked. Would we be free to attend church? Sundays would be your own, Hayes confirmed. I believe in the importance of spiritual life and family time. Lucy shifted in Margaret's lap, looking up at the banker with curious eyes. Mr. Hayes, will your house have books? Hayes smiled, and for the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely pleased. Yes, Lucy, I have quite a large library. Do you like to read? Mama taught me some letters, Lucy said proudly. But we don't have many books. Well, we'll have to fix that, won't we? Hayes's smile widened. I think you'll find plenty of books to keep you busy. Margaret felt something ease in her chest. This man genuinely seemed to care about Lucy's welfare, not just her usefulness as a housekeeper's daughter. There's one more thing, Hayes said, his expression becoming serious again. I want you to understand that this is a business arrangement. You would be my employee, not my charity case. I expect hard work and professionalism. In return, I promise fair treatment and respect. Margaret appreciated his directness. She had been dreading the possibility that he might see them as objects of pity, recipients of his Christian charity rather than people with dignity and worth. When would you want us to start? She asked. As soon as possible. The bank will need to take possession of this property within the week to settle your husband's debts. I can have a wagon here tomorrow morning to transport your belongings. Tomorrow morning. Margaret felt a flutter of panic at how quickly her old life was ending and her new one beginning. But there was no point in delaying the inevitable. We'll be ready, she said. Hayes stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mrs. Calloway, may I speak frankly? Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear what he had to say. I know this situation isn't what you would have chosen for yourself or your daughter, but I want you to know that I don't take the responsibility lightly. Your welfare and Lucy's education will be my priority. Why? Margaret asked before she could stop herself. "Why are you helping us?" Hayes was quiet for a moment, looking out at the failing farm that had once been someone's dream. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally. "And because a house isn't a home without family in it." After he left, Margaret sat in the silence of the house she was about to leave forever. Lucy had gone to her room to pack her few toys and clothes, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the weight of the decision she had made. She walked through each room one last time, remembering the hopes she and James had brought to this place. The bedroom where Lucy had been born during a snowstorm. The kitchen where they had shared quiet breakfasts and planned their future. The front porch where James had promised to build her a swing someday. All of it would soon belong to the bank, sold to pay debts that would follow them even in death. But perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps holding on to the past would only make it harder to embrace whatever the future held. That evening, as she tucked Lucy into bed for the last time in the room where she'd always slept, Margaret tried to prepare her daughter for the changes ahead. "Are you scared?" she asked, smoothing the quilt that James's mother had made. Lucy considered the question seriously. "A little, but also excited. Mr. Hayes seems nice, and I've never lived in a town before." "It will be different from here," Margaret warned. "There will be new rules and new people. You'll have to work hard in school and mind your manners at all times." "I will, Mama," Lucy promised. "I want to make you proud." Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood that would remain constant even as everything else changed. "You already make me proud every day." As night fell over the Kansas prairie for the last time they would see it from this house, Margaret made herself a promise. She would work harder than Benjamin Hayes expected. She would prove that his faith in them was justified. And she would build a new life for Lucy that honored the past without being trapped by it. Tomorrow would bring changes that would test them both, but tonight they were still safe in the place they had always called home. It would have to be enough. The massive white house rose before them like a castle from one of Lucy's fairy tale books, its tall columns reaching toward the cloudy September sky. Margaret gripped the side of the wagon seat as they rolled up the circular driveway, her stomach twisting with nerves she tried to hide from her daughter. "It's even bigger than it looked from the road," Lucy whispered, her eyes wide as saucers as she took in the wraparound porch, the perfectly painted shutters, and the manicured gardens that surrounded the property. Margaret had seen the Hayes mansion from a distance during their few trips to Millfield, but being this close made her realize just how different their new world would be. Everything here spoke of wealth and refinement, from the brass fixtures gleaming in the afternoon sun to the spotless windows that reflected their approach like watching eyes. Benjamin Hayes emerged from the front door as their wagon pulled to a stop, looking every inch the prosperous banker in his crisp white shirt and perfectly pressed vest. But his smile seemed genuine as he approached, and Margaret noticed he addressed Lucy first. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Lucy," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the wagon. "I hope you'll be happy here." Lucy accepted his help with the careful politeness Margaret had drilled into her during the long ride to town. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Your house is very beautiful." "Thank you. And please, you may call me Benjamin if your mother approves." Margaret felt a flutter of surprise at the informal suggestion, but nodded her consent. In her experience, wealthy men insisted on titles and proper respect. This small gesture suggested Benjamin Hayes might be different from what she expected. "Let me show you to your quarters," Benjamin said, gesturing toward a side entrance Margaret hadn't noticed before. "I thought you might prefer your own space rather than being housed with the other staff." Other staff? Margaret realized she had no idea how many people worked in this house or what her place among them would be. The uncertainty made her feel even more like a stranger stepping into a world where she didn't understand the rules. Their quarters turned out to be a small but comfortable apartment attached to the main house. 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and their own wash basin. The furniture was simple but well-made, and everything was spotlessly clean. Most importantly, it felt private, like a real home rather than servants' quarters. "This is wonderful," Margaret said, and meant it. After months of sleeping in a house that leaked when it rained and let in cold drafts when the wind blew, these rooms felt like luxury. I'm glad you approve, Benjamin said. Lucy, would you like to see the library I mentioned? Lucy's face lit up like Christmas morning. Yes, please. Benjamin led them through a doorway Margaret hadn't noticed, and suddenly they were inside the main house. The hallway was lined with paintings and lit by crystal fixtures that cast rainbow patterns on the polished wooden floors. Margaret felt herself walking more carefully, afraid her worn boots might scuff something valuable. The library took Margaret's breath away. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, more books than she had ever seen in one place. A rolling ladder allowed access to the highest shelves, and comfortable chairs were arranged near tall windows that let in plenty of reading light. Oh, Lucy breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. There are so many. Feel free to borrow any book you can read, Benjamin told her, though you might want to start with these. He led them to a lower shelf filled with books clearly meant for children, adventure stories, fairy tales, and educational volumes with colorful illustrations. Margaret watched her daughter's face transform with joy and felt her first real moment of hope since James's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Lucy would have opportunities here that Margaret could never have provided on her own. Now, let me introduce you to Mrs. Patterson, Benjamin said. She's been helping with the household since my wife passed, and she'll show you the routines. Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked Margaret up and down with measuring eyes, clearly evaluating whether this new addition to the household would meet her standards. So you're the widow Hayes has taken in, she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Well, there's plenty of work to be done. This house doesn't clean itself. Over the next hour, Mrs. Patterson led Margaret through the mansion, explaining the daily routines and expectations. The house was indeed large, 12 rooms not counting the kitchen, pantries, and storage areas. Every surface gleamed with polish, every piece of silver shone like a mirror, and Margaret began to understand the scope of her new responsibilities. Mr. Hayes likes his breakfast at exactly 7 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson explained as they toured the spacious kitchen. Coffee first, then eggs, bacon, and toast. He reads his newspaper while he eats, so don't chatter at him. Margaret nodded, making mental notes of everything. She had always been a good cook, but James had been easy to please. Cooking for a wealthy man with specific expectations would be entirely different. Dinner is at 6 sharp, Mrs. Patterson continued. 3 courses when he has guests, 2 when he dines alone. And he entertains frequently, other bankers, town officials, business associates. You'll need to learn proper service. The list of responsibilities seemed endless. Laundry that required special care for fine fabrics, silver that needed daily polishing, floors that must be swept and mopped according to a strict schedule. Margaret felt overwhelmed but determined to prove herself worthy of Benjamin's trust. The child will need to be ready for school each morning by 8, Mrs. Patterson said, glancing toward the library where Lucy was still exploring. Clean dress, neat hair, proper shoes. Mr. Hayes won't tolerate slovenly appearance. Of course, Margaret agreed, though she worried about Lucy's limited wardrobe. Would her patched dresses be acceptable for town school, or would they mark her as a servant's daughter? As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. There's a dressmaker in town who does good work at fair prices. Mr. Hayes provides an allowance for household necessities. That evening, after Mrs. Patterson had returned to her own home in town, Margaret sat with Lucy in their new sitting room and tried to process everything that had changed in a single day. Their old life felt like something from a dream, distant and unreal compared to the luxuries surrounding them now. Do you like it here? Margaret asked, watching Lucy examine a beautiful illustrated book about faraway places. I think so, Lucy said thoughtfully. Everyone seems nice, and there are so many books to read, but it feels strange, doesn't it? Like we're visiting someone else's life. Margaret knew exactly what her daughter meant. Everything here was beautiful and comfortable, but it belonged to Benjamin Hayes. They were guests in his world, dependent on his kindness and subject to his rules. It will take time to feel like home, Margaret said, though she wondered if it ever truly would. But we'll make the best of it, won't we? Lucy nodded, then looked up at her mother with serious eyes. "Mama, do you think Papa would be happy that we're safe now?" The question caught Margaret off guard, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. I think Papa would be very happy knowing you're warm and fed and surrounded by books to read." As they prepared for bed in their new rooms, Margaret tried to quiet the voice in her head that whispered she didn't belong in this elegant house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she learned to navigate her role as housekeeper to one of the most important men in town. But tonight, listening to Lucy's peaceful breathing in the next room and feeling truly safe for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps Benjamin Hayes's kindness might be the beginning of something better than mere survival. The question was whether she could prove herself worthy of the chance he had given them. "You're burning the bacon." Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice cut through the kitchen like a knife as smoke began rising from the cast iron pan. Margaret rushed to move it off the heat, her face flushing with embarrassment as she scraped the charred meat onto a plate. It was her third morning in the Hayes household, and everything seemed determined to go wrong. She had overslept by 10 minutes, Lucy had spilled milk on her school dress, and now breakfast was ruined just as Benjamin was due to come downstairs. "Start over," Mrs. Patterson commanded, already setting out fresh bacon from the pantry. "And this time, watch the temperature. Mr. Hayes doesn't tolerate burnt food." Margaret's hands shook as she lit the stove again, acutely aware that Benjamin would appear any moment expecting his precisely timed meal. She had cooked for her family for years, but somehow the pressure of this elegant kitchen and its exacting standards made her feel clumsy and incompetent. "Mama, I can't find my school books," Lucy called from their quarters, her voice tight with worry. "They're on the table where you left them," Margaret called back, trying to keep the stress out of her voice. She cracked eggs into the fresh pan, praying they wouldn't stick or break or somehow disappoint the man whose kindness was keeping them fed and sheltered. The sound of footsteps on the main staircase made her heart race faster. Benjamin Hayes appeared in the kitchen doorway exactly at 7 o'clock, dressed impeccably as always, his dark hair neatly combed and his expression expectant. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway," he said pleasantly, settling at the small table where he took his breakfast. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you," Margaret replied, sliding the eggs onto his plate with hands that barely trembled. The bacon this time was golden brown and perfect, and she felt a surge of relief. Benjamin unfolded his newspaper as Mrs. Patterson had instructed, but instead of ignoring Margaret completely, he glanced up with what looked like genuine interest. "And how is Lucy adjusting to school?" Margaret paused in her task of cleaning the pan, surprised by the question. "She loves it. The teacher says she's very bright and eager to learn." "I'm glad to hear it." Benjamin smiled as he took his first bite of breakfast. Education opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more carefully. There was a thoughtfulness in his expression that suggested he spoke from personal experience, perhaps remembering his own childhood and the opportunities that education had provided. "Was your family always in banking?" Margaret asked, then immediately wondered if she had overstepped by asking such a personal question. But Benjamin didn't seem offended. "My father was a blacksmith," he said, cutting his eggs with precise movements. "I learned numbers by helping him calculate costs for horseshoes and wagon repairs. When a banker saw my skill with figures, he offered me a position as a clerk." The revelation surprised Margaret. She had assumed Benjamin came from the same privileged background as his current lifestyle suggested. Learning that he had worked his way up from humble beginnings made him seem more human, somehow less intimidating. "That must have taken considerable determination," she observed. "Determination and a willingness to learn from mistakes," Benjamin replied, then looked directly at her. "Speaking of which, don't let Mrs. Patterson's criticism discourage you. She means well, but she sometimes forgets that perfection takes practice." The kindness in his voice made Margaret's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had encouraged her instead of pointing out her failures? "Mr. Hayes, I'm ready for school." Lucy burst into the kitchen wearing her neatest dress and carrying her school books in a canvas bag Benjamin had provided. Her hair was braided perfectly, and her face glowed with excitement. "You look very scholarly, Miss Lucy," Benjamin said with mock seriousness. "I expect to hear good reports of your progress." Lucy beamed under his attention. "I'm going to read a whole book this week. Miss Johnson says I'm one of her best students already." Margaret felt a pang of bittersweet pride. Lucy was thriving in ways that would never have been possible on their failing farm. But watching her daughter's obvious affection for Benjamin also stirred complicated feelings Margaret wasn't ready to examine. After Lucy left for school and Benjamin departed for his bank, Margaret spent the morning learning the intricate routine of maintaining the mansion. Every room had its own requirements, different polish for different woods, special care for delicate fabrics, specific methods for cleaning crystal and silver. "The key is consistency," Mrs. Patterson explained as they worked together in the front parlor. "Mr. Hayes likes his home to run like clockwork. No surprises, no disruptions." Margaret found herself wondering about the woman Benjamin had married, the one whose death had left him alone in this perfectly maintained house. What had she been like? Had she loved the orderly routine, or had she longed for something more spontaneous and alive? Around noon, while dusting the mantelpiece in Benjamin's study, Margaret discovered a small portrait tucked behind a larger painting. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in a delicate way, with light hair arranged in fashionable curls and wearing an expensive dress. But her expression seemed sad, almost wistful, as if she were looking toward something just beyond the camera's reach. "That's Alice," a voice said behind her, and Margaret spun around to find Benjamin standing in the doorway. "I didn't expect you to find that." "I'm sorry," Margaret stammered, quickly setting the portrait back where she'd found it. "I was just dusting, and it fell forward." "It's all right," Benjamin said, walking over to take the photograph in his hands. "I put it there because looking at it every day became too painful. But hiding it hasn't made the missing any easier." Margaret studied his face as he gazed at his wife's portrait. The pain there was real and deep, the kind that came from losing someone truly beloved. It made her think of her own grief for James, though her feelings were more complicated, mixed with anger and disappointment alongside the sorrow. "She was very beautiful," Margaret said softly. "She was." Benjamin set the portrait on his desk where he could see it. "Alice always said this house was too quiet, that it needed children's laughter to make it come alive. I think she would have liked hearing Lucy practice her reading in the library." The comment hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of this arrangement. Perhaps Benjamin's offer of employment had been motivated by more than simple charity. Perhaps he, too, was lonely in this grand house, missing the warmth of family life. "I should let you get back to your work," Benjamin said, settling behind his desk with papers from the bank. "But Mrs. Calloway, thank you for bringing life back to this house. It's been quieter than it should be." As Margaret returned to her dusting, she found herself thinking about loneliness and second chances, about the different ways people could need each other beyond simple employer and employee. The question forming in her mind was one she didn't dare voice aloud. What if this arrangement could become something more than a business transaction? But such thoughts were dangerous for a woman in her position. She was the housekeeper, dependent on Benjamin's goodwill for her survival and her daughter's future. To imagine anything more would be foolish beyond measure. Still, as she worked her way through the quiet rooms of the mansion, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that both she and Benjamin were searching for something neither had found, and that perhaps, if they were brave enough, they might find it together. The crash of breaking dishes echoed through the dining room like thunder, followed by Margaret's horrified gasp as she stared at the shattered remains of Benjamin's finest china scattered across the polished floor. 3 weeks of perfect service, and now this, right in front of the most important dinner guests Benjamin had ever entertained. "Oh no," Lucy whispered from the doorway where she'd been watching the elegant dinner party with wide, curious eyes. Margaret dropped to her knees immediately, frantically gathering the broken pieces while her face burned with shame. Around the mahogany dining table, 5 of Millfield's most prominent citizens sat in uncomfortable silence, their conversation about railroad investments forgotten as they witnessed the clumsy servant's mistake. "Please, don't trouble yourself," said Mrs. Victoria Ashford, the banker's wife from the neighboring town, though her tone suggested she was anything but sympathetic. Accidents happen when one employs inexperienced help. The word stung like a slap. Margaret's hands trembled as she collected the larger fragments, trying to ignore the whispered comments from the other guests about widows taking positions they're unfit for, and the decline of proper household standards. Benjamin rose from his chair, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Calloway, please leave that. I'll have someone clean it properly tomorrow. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered, unable to meet his eyes. I don't know how it slipped. Accidents happen, Benjamin said firmly, his voice carrying enough authority to silence the murmuring guests. Lucy, would you help your mother to the kitchen? I believe dinner is concluded for this evening. As Margaret hurried from the room with Lucy close behind her, she heard Mrs. Ashford's voice rising again. Really, Benjamin? Surely you can find more suitable staff. There are agencies that provide properly trained domestics. In the kitchen, Margaret sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. 3 weeks of careful work, of proving herself capable and worthy of Benjamin's trust, destroyed in a single moment of clumsiness. The broken china represented more than dishes. It was evidence that she didn't belong in this refined world, that she was exactly what Mrs. Ashford had called her. Inexperienced help. It was just an accident, Mama, Lucy said, wrapping her small arms around Margaret's shoulders. Everyone drops things sometimes. Not everyone breaks their employer's best dishes in front of his most important guests, Margaret replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. What if he decides we're more trouble than we're worth? What if he asks us to leave? The thought terrified her more than she cared to admit, not just because they had nowhere else to go, but because somewhere in the past 3 weeks this house had begun to feel like home. Lucy was flourishing at school, making friends and learning more each day, and Margaret herself had started to feel useful again, competent in ways that went beyond mere survival. More troubling still were the feelings she'd been trying to ignore, the way her heart quickened when Benjamin smiled at her accomplishments, the warmth that spread through her chest when he asked about her day or praised Lucy's progress. She had no right to such feelings, but they had grown despite her best efforts to contain them. Maybe he won't be angry, Lucy said hopefully. He seems too nice to be angry about broken dishes. Before Margaret could respond, footsteps approached the kitchen. Benjamin appeared in the doorway, having seen his guests to their carriages. His expression was serious, and Margaret braced herself for the dismissal she was certain was coming. Mrs. Calloway, may I speak with you privately? He asked. Margaret's stomach clenched. Lucy, go to our rooms and get ready for bed, she said quietly. But Mama, please, sweetheart, I'll be along shortly. After Lucy reluctantly left, Benjamin pulled out a chair and sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. The informality of the gesture surprised her. She had expected him to summon her to his study like a servant called to account for her failures. I owe you an apology, he said, and Margaret's head snapped up in shock. Sir, Mrs. Ashford and her companions were inexcusably rude this evening. Their comments about your qualifications and background were inappropriate and unkind. Benjamin's jaw tightened. I should have addressed their behavior immediately instead of allowing them to make you feel unwelcome in your own home. Your own home. The words sent a strange flutter through Margaret's chest. Mr. Hayes, I broke your china, she said. Valuable pieces that probably can't be replaced. They had every right to question my competence. They were dishes, Benjamin replied with a dismissive wave. Expensive, yes, but replaceable. What's not replaceable is your dignity, which they had no right to attack. Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. In her experience, wealthy men protected their possessions and their social standing above all else. The idea that Benjamin cared more about her feelings than his expensive china seemed almost impossible. I've been thinking, Benjamin continued, that perhaps I've been unfair to you, expecting you to master the requirements of formal entertaining without proper training was unreasonable. If you're willing, I'd like to arrange for you to spend some time with Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper at the Riverside Hotel. She's known for her expertise in managing large household staff and elegant service. You want me to learn proper service? Margaret asked, confused. She had expected termination, not training. I want you to feel confident in any situation this household might present, Benjamin said. You're intelligent and capable, Mrs. Calloway. You simply need experience with the conventions of formal society. The offer was generous beyond anything Margaret had dared hope for, but it also highlighted the gulf between her background and the expectations of Benjamin's world. Was she foolish to think she could bridge that gap, or brave to try? There's something else, Benjamin said, his voice becoming gentler. I noticed how Lucy's eyes lit up when she saw the dinner table set with the good china and crystal. She's curious about the wider world, about customs and traditions beyond what she's known. Perhaps she could join you for some of these lessons, not as a servant in training, but as a young lady learning proper deportment. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. Benjamin wasn't just offering to improve her skills as his housekeeper. He was offering to give Lucy the social education that could open doors Margaret had never imagined possible. Why? She whispered. Why would you invest so much in teaching us things we may never need to know? Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands folded on the table. When he looked up, there was something vulnerable in his expression that Margaret had never seen before. Because I believe people deserve the chance to become more than their circumstances dictate, he said. And because this house has been happier with you and Lucy in it than it's been in 2 years. I'd like to keep you both here, if you're willing to stay. The words hung between them, loaded with meanings Margaret didn't dare interpret. But the warmth in Benjamin's voice and the sincerity in his eyes made her feel something she hadn't experienced since before James died. Hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival. We'd be honored to stay, she said softly, and to learn whatever you think we should know. Benjamin smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Excellent. We'll start next week. But for now, don't give another thought to those broken dishes. They were never as valuable as the people who live in this house. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a farmer's wife struggling to keep her family fed. Now she was living in a mansion, learning to navigate high society, and feeling the stirring of emotions she had thought died with her marriage. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether she could learn the skills Benjamin wanted to teach her. It was whether she could guard her heart against hoping for something that might be impossible. Because somewhere between the broken china and Benjamin's unexpected kindness, Margaret had begun to wonder if this arrangement might become something far more dangerous than employment. It might become love. Hold your back straighter, like you're balancing a book on your head, Mrs. Henderson instructed, demonstrating the proper posture for serving at formal dinner. Margaret tried to copy her movements, concentrating on keeping her shoulders level while carrying a silver tray laden with empty teacups. 2 weeks had passed since the disastrous dinner party, and Margaret found herself in the elegant training rooms of the Riverside Hotel every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson, a woman of 50 with steel-gray hair and an eye for the smallest details, had taken on Margaret's education with the seriousness of a military commander. Better, Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. Now, remember, always serve from the left, clear from the right. Never reach across a guest, and never, ever let them see you struggling with the weight of what you're carrying. Lucy sat at a small table nearby, practicing her own lessons in deportment. She held a teacup with exaggerated delicacy, her pinky finger properly positioned, her back as straight as a soldier's. The sight of her 7-year-old daughter learning the manners of a lady made Margaret's heart swell with pride and something else, a fierce protectiveness for the opportunities Benjamin was providing. "Mama, look," Lucy said, carefully setting down her cup without a sound. "I didn't make any noise at all." "Very good, dear," Mrs. Henderson said with the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her. "You're learning faster than most girls twice your age." The compliment made Lucy beam, and Margaret felt grateful again for Benjamin's suggestion that Lucy join these lessons. Whether or not her daughter would ever need such refined skills, learning them was building her confidence and expanding her understanding of the world beyond their small experience. Now then, Mrs. Calloway, Mrs. Henderson continued, let's practice conversation during service. A skilled housekeeper must be able to respond appropriately to guests without seeming forward or familiar. Margaret nodded, though the idea of casual conversation with Millfield's elite still intimidated her. What did she, a farmer's widow, have to say to bankers' wives and railroad investors? Pretend I'm Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Henderson said, settling into a chair with the imperious air of that difficult woman. She's just made a comment about the weather being unseasonably warm for October. Margaret approached with her tray, trying to remember everything she'd learned. Yes, ma'am, she said carefully, though I believe the farmers are grateful for the extended growing season. Good. Mrs. Henderson dropped her act and smiled. You acknowledged her comment, agreed politely, and added something relevant without being presumptuous. That's exactly the tone to strike. The praise warmed Margaret more than it should have. These small victories felt enormous after years of feeling incompetent and out of place in any world beyond her farm kitchen. Mrs. Calloway, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice becoming more serious. May I speak frankly about your employer? Margaret felt her cheeks flush. Of course. Mr. Hayes is highly regarded in this town, but he's also been the subject of considerable speculation since his wife's death. Many prominent families have daughters or widowed sisters they'd like to see him consider for remarriage. The words hit Margaret like cold water. Of course, women of Benjamin's social standing would be interested in him. He was wealthy, kind, and still young enough to father children. The idea of him courting one of Millfield's refined ladies made her stomach twist with an emotion she didn't want to name. I mention this, Mrs. Henderson continued, because your position in his household has been noticed. There are those who might view your presence as inappropriate. I'm his housekeeper, Margaret said quickly. Nothing more. Mrs. Henderson studied her with sharp eyes. Of course, dear, but appearances matter in society, and a widowed man living alone with an attractive young widow can cause talk, regardless of the actual relationship. The warning was clear, even couched in Mrs. Henderson's diplomatic language. Margaret's reputation, and by extension, Lucy's future, could be damaged by gossip and speculation. The comfortable arrangement she had begun to take for granted was more fragile than she had realized. What do you suggest? Margaret asked. Be above reproach in all things, Mrs. Henderson replied. Maintain proper boundaries. Ensure you're never alone with Mr. Hayes in circumstances that could be misinterpreted. And remember that your first duty is to your daughter's welfare. That evening, Margaret returned to the Hayes mansion with her mind churning. She had been so focused on learning her new role and settling into their comfortable routine that she hadn't considered how their situation might appear to others. Now Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her thoughts, mixing with uncomfortable memories of Mrs. Ashford's disapproving looks. How were your lessons today? Benjamin asked as she entered the kitchen to prepare dinner. He was sitting at the small table where he sometimes took his evening coffee, reviewing papers from the bank. Very informative, Margaret replied, busying herself with checking the roast she'd left cooking. His presence in the kitchen suddenly felt different, more intimate than appropriate for an employer and housekeeper. Mrs. Henderson is an excellent teacher, Benjamin said. I'm sure you'll master everything she has to teach you. Margaret nodded, keeping her attention focused on her cooking tasks. But she was acutely aware of Benjamin's presence, of the way he watched her move around the kitchen with an expression that seemed warmer than mere professional interest. Margaret, he said, and the use of her first name made her heart skip. I wanted to thank you for the extra effort you've been putting into these lessons. I know they require time away from your regular duties, and I appreciate your dedication. It's nothing, Margaret said, though her voice came out higher than normal. You're investing in our education. The least I can do is take it seriously. It's not nothing, Benjamin said, rising from his chair. You could have been content with simply keeping house and raising Lucy. Instead, you're working to better yourself, to expand your capabilities. That takes courage. He was standing closer now, close enough that Margaret could smell the subtle scent of his soap and see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. For a moment, the kitchen felt charged with possibility, with the electric sense that something important was about to happen. Then Lucy's voice called from the library, "Mama, can you help me with this word?" The spell broke, and Margaret stepped back, busying herself with stirring a pot that didn't need stirring. "I should help her with her reading," she said. "Of course," Benjamin replied, but his voice held a note of disappointment that made Margaret's heart ache. As she helped Lucy with her homework that evening, Margaret tried to push away the memory of that moment in the kitchen. Mrs. Henderson's warnings echoed in her mind. Maintain proper boundaries, be above reproach. Remember that your first duty is to your daughter's welfare. But as she tucked Lucy into bed and listened to her chatter about school and friends and all the books she wanted to read, Margaret couldn't help wondering what it would be like to have someone besides herself invested in Lucy's happiness. What would it be like to share the burdens and joys of parenthood with someone who cared about her daughter's future as much as she did? The thought was dangerous, she knew. Benjamin Hayes was her employer, nothing more. To imagine otherwise was to risk everything they had gained. The security, the education, the chance for Lucy to become more than circumstances had intended. But late that night, as Margaret lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around them, she found herself wondering if some risks might be worth taking. If the possibility of love, real, honest love, might be worth the danger of losing everything else. The question that haunted her dreams was whether Benjamin Hayes might be wondering the same thing, and whether two lonely people might find the courage to risk their carefully maintained boundaries for the chance at something infinitely more precious than mere security. The letter arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by a rider whose horse steamed in the frosty air as Margaret signed for the envelope with hands that trembled for more than just the winter chill. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, but something about the formal script made her stomach clench with dread. "Who's it from, Mama?" Lucy asked, looking up from her breakfast porridge while trying to balance her school books on her lap. Margaret turned the envelope over, reading the return address twice before the words sank in. Robert Calloway, San Francisco, California. James's brother, the one who had disappeared west years ago, the one they had never heard from even when James died. "It's from your Uncle Robert," Margaret said quietly, setting the letter on the kitchen table as if it might burn her fingers. "I didn't even know he was aware of what happened to your father." Lucy's eyes widened with curiosity. "We have an uncle? Can I meet him?" "He lives very far away, sweetheart. In California, on the other side of the country." Margaret stared at the envelope, afraid to open it. Good news rarely came by mail to people in their situation, and the timing felt ominous, just when their life here had begun to feel stable and secure. Benjamin appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for his morning ride to the bank. "Good morning," he said, then paused as he noticed Margaret's pale face. "Is everything all right?" "I received a letter from my late husband's brother," Margaret replied, still not touching the envelope. "I haven't heard from him in over 5 years. Benjamin's expression grew concerned. "Would you like privacy to read it?" Margaret almost said yes, but something in his tone, a careful distance that hadn't been there yesterday, made her reconsider. "No, it's fine. Lucy should probably hear whatever it says anyway." With fingers that felt clumsy and cold, Margaret broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting neat and educated. As she read the words silently, her face must have betrayed her shock because Benjamin took a step closer. "What does it say?" Lucy asked, abandoning her porridge entirely. Margaret cleared her throat and read aloud. "Dear Margaret and Lucy, I was deeply saddened to learn of my brother's death through a mutual acquaintance who recently traveled from Kansas to California. I had hoped to reconcile with James before it was too late, but God's timing is not always our own." She paused, her voice catching slightly before she continued. "I have established myself in the shipping business here in San Francisco and am now in a position to offer you both a home and a fresh start. California offers opportunities that Kansas cannot, particularly for a young girl's education and future prospects. I have enclosed funds for your travel expenses and hope you will consider making the journey west." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of Lucy's spoon clattering against her bowl as she set it down. "He wants us to move to California?" Lucy asked, her voice small and uncertain. Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading. I understand this request may come as a surprise, but I feel responsible for my brother's family. A widow and child deserve better than the uncertain circumstances that frontier life provides. San Francisco society is more progressive than most. There are excellent schools, cultural opportunities, and the possibility of advantageous connections for Lucy's future. Benjamin had gone very still, his expression carefully neutral in a way that reminded Margaret of his banker's face during difficult business discussions. There's more, Margaret said, though her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I have taken the liberty of making inquiries about your current situation. While I'm sure your employer has been kind, domestic service is no life for a woman of your obvious intelligence and capabilities. Here, you could establish yourself as an independent businesswoman, perhaps opening a dress shop or boarding house. The enclosed bank draft should be sufficient for travel expenses and initial establishment costs. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached into the envelope and pulled out a bank draft. The amount written there made her gasp. $500, more money than she had ever seen in one place. $500, she whispered, staring at the paper. That's more than a year's wages, Benjamin finished quietly, his voice flat. Lucy slipped from her chair and came to stand beside Margaret, looking at the bank draft with wide eyes. Are we rich now, Mama? No, sweetheart, Margaret said, though her mind was reeling. This money comes with expectations. Your uncle wants us to come live with him. But I don't want to leave, Lucy said, her voice rising with distress. I like my school, and my friends, and Benjamin, and all the books in the library. Margaret looked up to find Benjamin watching them both with an expression that seemed carefully controlled. This is quite an opportunity, he said, and his formal tone sent a chill through Margaret's chest. Your brother-in-law seems to be offering you independence and security. Mr. Hayes, Margaret began, but he held up a hand. Benjamin, he corrected gently. I think we've moved past formalities, haven't we? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings Margaret didn't dare interpret. She had grown so comfortable in their routine, so settled in their roles, that she had forgotten how precarious their situation really was. She was still just the housekeeper, dependent on Benjamin's goodwill, with no real claim to the life they had built here. You should consider this carefully, Benjamin continued, his voice becoming more distant. California offers opportunities that a small Kansas town cannot. For Lucy especially, the education, the cultural advantages, the chance to make connections that could benefit her throughout her life. Margaret felt as if she were watching their comfortable world crumble from a great distance. Benjamin was being practical, sensible, even encouraging about an opportunity that would take them away from him forever. Did that mean he didn't care if they left? Had she been foolish to imagine that their relationship had become something more than employer and employee? When would we have to decide? Margaret asked, though her voice sounded hollow. Uncle Robert says the ship sails from New Orleans on December 15th, she read from the letter. He's arranged passage and suggests we leave Kansas by the end of this month to allow time for the overland journey. The end of November, Benjamin said, calculating quickly. 3 weeks from now. Lucy burst into tears. I don't want to go. This is our home. Why can't Uncle Robert come visit us instead? Margaret pulled her daughter close, but her own eyes were burning with unshed tears. Lucy was right. This had become their home. The thought of leaving Benjamin, of giving up the life they had built here, felt like losing James all over again. But as she looked at the bank draft in her hands, Margaret forced herself to think practically. $500 represented security, independence, the chance to give Lucy opportunities she could never provide on a housekeeper's wages. It represented escape from the gossip and speculation that Mrs. Henderson had warned her about, freedom from the uncertainty of depending on Benjamin's continued goodwill. We don't have to decide today, Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. Uncle Robert is offering us a chance for a better life. We should at least consider it seriously. Benjamin nodded, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or hurt. Of course, this is a decision only you can make. As he left for the bank that morning, Margaret noticed that his goodbye was more formal than usual, more distant. The easy warmth that had developed between them over the past months seemed to have evaporated with the arrival of Robert's letter. The rest of the day passed in a haze of conflicted thoughts. Margaret went through her household routines mechanically while her mind churned with possibilities and fears. California represented adventure, independence, and opportunity. Everything a practical woman should want for herself and her daughter. But it also represented leaving behind the first place that had felt like home since James died. Abandoning the man who had shown them both kindness when they needed it most, and starting over yet again in a world where they knew no one. That evening, as Margaret helped Lucy with her homework, her daughter looked up with solemn eyes. "Mama, if you loved someone once, you love them again, right? That's what Papa used to say about you when you were fighting." The innocent question hit Margaret like a physical blow. "What made you think of that, sweetheart?" "I was thinking about how much I love Benjamin, and how much I love our life here, and I was wondering if love like that ever really goes away, even if people have to leave each other." Margaret stared at her daughter, amazed once again by the wisdom hidden in her young heart. Lucy had put her finger on the central question that Margaret had been afraid to ask herself. What if leaving Benjamin meant giving up not just security, but love? The question that would haunt her for the next 3 weeks was whether love, real, honest love, was worth more than independence and opportunity. And whether she was brave enough to find out if Benjamin Hayes might be willing to risk his carefully ordered life for the chance at something infinitely more precious than a business arrangement. "He barely looked at me during breakfast," Margaret confided to Mrs. Henderson as they arranged flowers in the hotel's front parlor, her voice heavy with confusion and hurt. "For 2 weeks now, ever since the letter came, Benjamin has been polite but distant. Like I'm a stranger he's being kind to out of obligation." Mrs. Henderson's weathered hands paused in their arrangement of autumn chrysanthemums. "And what did you expect, dear? The man has feelings, even if he's too much of a gentleman to express them inappropriately." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I don't understand what you mean. Don't you?" Mrs. Henderson gave her a knowing look. "A widowed man grows fond of the woman who's brought warmth back to his empty house, and suddenly she's planning to leave for California with another man. What did you think his reaction would be?" The words hit Margaret like cold water. She had been so focused on her own conflicted feelings about Robert's offer that she hadn't considered how her uncertainty might appear to Benjamin. From his perspective, she was probably already planning her departure, counting the days until she could escape her humble position for something better. "But I haven't decided anything yet," Margaret protested. "I've barely even spoken to Lucy about it properly." "Have you told him that?" Mrs. Henderson asked pointedly. "Or have you been carrying that letter around like a guilty secret, letting him assume the worst?" Margaret's stomach sank as she realized how her behavior must look to Benjamin. She had been withdrawn and distracted, spending hours staring at Robert's letter and the bank draft while saying nothing about her thoughts or feelings. No wonder Benjamin had retreated behind his careful politeness. "I've made a mess of everything, haven't I?" Margaret said miserably. "Nothing that can't be fixed with an honest conversation," Mrs. Henderson replied. "But you need to decide what you truly want before you can explain it to anyone else." That afternoon, Margaret walked slowly back to the Hayes mansion, her mind churning with Mrs. Henderson's advice. The November air was crisp and clean, with the sharp scent of winter approaching. In California, Robert had written, the weather stayed mild year-round, and Lucy could play outside every day. It sounded like paradise compared to the harsh Kansas winters. But as Margaret approached the familiar white columns of Benjamin's house, she realized that paradise meant nothing if you couldn't share it with the people you loved. She found Lucy in the library, curled up in the window seat with a book about faraway lands. The sight of her daughter reading contentedly in the golden afternoon light made Margaret's chest tighten with emotion. "Lucy, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about Uncle Robert's letter." Lucy looked up with serious eyes. "Are we going to California, Mama?" Margaret sat down beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "That depends on what you want. Uncle Robert is offering us opportunities we could never have here. Better schools, more chances for you to become whatever you dream of being." But it would mean leaving everything we've built here. What do you want to do? Lucy asked with the direct honesty of childhood. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, finally admitting to herself what her heart had known from the moment she read Robert's letter. I want to stay here. This feels like home to me in a way nowhere has since I was a child. But I'm afraid I'm being selfish, choosing what makes me happy over what might be best for your future. Lucy closed her book and looked at her mother with startling maturity. Mama, do you love Benjamin? The question, asked so simply by her 7-year-old daughter, made Margaret's breath catch. What makes you ask that? Because you smile different when he's around. And he looks at you the way Papa used to look at you before things got bad. And when you're both in the same room, it feels like… Lucy paused, searching for words. Like the house is more alive. Margaret stared at her daughter, amazed by her perceptiveness. Even if I did have feelings for Benjamin, that doesn't mean he feels the same way. He's been very distant lately. Maybe he's scared too, Lucy said with wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Maybe he thinks we want to leave, so he's trying not to care so much when we do. The insight hit Margaret like a revelation. What if Benjamin's coldness wasn't indifference but self-protection? What if he was guarding his heart against the pain of watching them leave? What do you think we should do? Margaret asked. Lucy grinned, suddenly looking like the child she was again. I think we should tell Uncle Robert thank you but no. And then we should tell Benjamin that we want to stay here forever and ever, and ask him if he wants us to. The simplicity of the solution made Margaret laugh despite her anxiety. It's not quite that easy, sweetheart. There are proprieties to consider, social expectations. Grown-ups make everything too complicated, Lucy interrupted. If you love someone and they love you, why does anything else matter? That evening, Margaret sat down with paper and pen to write 2 of the most important letters of her life. The first, to Robert Calloway, was polite but firm in declining his generous offer. She thanked him for his kindness but explained that she and Lucy had found their place in Kansas and wished to remain there. The second letter was much harder to write. It was addressed to Benjamin, asking if they could speak privately about something important. Margaret wrote and rewrote it 3 times before finally settling on simple honesty. I have something I need to tell you about Robert's letter and our decision. Could we talk after Lucy goes to bed tomorrow evening? She slipped the note under Benjamin's study door that night, then lay awake wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest decision she'd ever made. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Benjamin was polite but distant at breakfast, giving no indication that he'd received her note. Margaret went through her household duties in a haze of nervousness, practicing what she would say and trying to prepare for every possible response. Lucy seemed to sense the importance of the evening ahead. She was unusually well-behaved, eating her dinner without complaint and going to bed without argument when Margaret announced it was time. Good luck, Mama, she whispered as Margaret tucked her in. Remember, if you loved someone once, you love them again. Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead, drawing strength from Lucy's confidence. As she walked toward Benjamin's study, she reminded herself that some risks were worth taking, that love, real, honest love, might be worth more than security or social propriety. She knocked gently on the study door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Come in, Benjamin's voice called, and Margaret took a deep breath before entering the room where her future would be decided. Benjamin stood by the fireplace, his expression guarded but attentive. You wanted to speak with me? Yes, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. I have something important to tell you about California, about Robert's offer, and about what Lucy and I have decided. As she began to speak, Margaret realized that this conversation would determine not just their immediate future, but whether 2 lonely people could find the courage to risk everything for the chance at love. The question that remained was whether Benjamin Hayes was ready to hear what she had come to say.